The autumn rain fell in relentless sheets across the Yorkshire countryside, turning the narrow roads into rivers of mud and the rolling hills into a grey, sodden landscape that seemed to mirror the bleakness of Arabella Hawthorne's existence. From the window of Rosewood Cottage, a modest dwelling that had once served as the estate's dower house, she watched the storm gather strength, her breath fogging the cold glass as thunder rumbled in the distance. 24 years of life, and this was what remained, a small house on the edge of her family's vast estate, close enough to see the grand manor where she'd been born, yet worlds away from the life she'd once known. 6 years had passed since her father's death. 6 years since Lady Prudence, her stepmother, had systematically erased her from the family she'd loved. Arabella pressed her palm against the window, feeling the chill seep through her skin. She could see Hawthorne Manor in the distance, its imposing Georgian facade barely visible through the rain. Somewhere in those opulent rooms, her half-sister Cordelia was likely being fussed over by their stepmother, prepared and polished like a prize mare for the marriage market. At 18, Cordelia had everything Arabella had lost: legitimacy in Lady Prudence's eyes, a place at the family table, a future. "You're too beautiful," Lady Prudence had declared the day after the funeral, her voice cold and final. "Too wild, too noticed. You'll eclipse my daughter, and I won't have it. Your father spoiled you terribly, allowed you freedoms no proper young lady should possess. That ends now." The exile had been swift and absolute. Arabella was given Rosewood Cottage, a small allowance barely sufficient for survival, and a single elderly servant, Mrs. Beatrice Marsh, who had been her nursemaid and refused to abandon her even when dismissed. The rest of society was told that Miss Hawthorne preferred the quiet life of the countryside, that she was bookish and reclusive by nature. The truth, that she'd been banished to prevent her beauty from overshadowing her plain half-sister, remained a carefully guarded secret. "Miss Arabella, you'll catch your death standing by that draughty window," Mrs. Marsh chided gently, entering the small parlour with a tea tray. At 63, Beatrice Marsh was the only constant in Arabella's fractured world, the only person who remembered the laughing child she'd been before her mother's death in childbirth, before her father's grief-stricken remarriage to the calculating Lady Prudence. Arabella turned from the window, managing a small smile. "The cold doesn't bother me, Bea. You know that. What I know is that you've been standing there for an hour, staring at that great pile of stones where you should rightfully be living." Mrs. Marsh set down the tray with more force than necessary. "It's not natural, a young woman living in isolation like this. Your father would be heartsick if he could see what that woman has done." "My father made his choice when he married her," Arabella said quietly, accepting the cup of tea. "He thought Cordelia needed a mother, and Lady Prudence seemed suitable enough. He couldn't have known. Couldn't have known she'd turn into a viper the moment he was in the ground. The man was brilliant in business, but blind as a post when it came to that woman's character." Mrs. Marsh settled into her chair with a huff. "And now she parades that insipid girl about as though Cordelia were the crown jewels, when everyone with eyes can see she's got all the personality of a turnip." Despite herself, Arabella laughed. "Bea, that's unkind. It's the truth. Cordelia's a sweet enough girl, I'll grant, but she's been so thoroughly moulded by that mother of hers that there's nothing left of her own spirit. Not like you, child. You've got fire in you, same as your dear mother did." The fire, Arabella thought bitterly, was precisely what Lady Prudence couldn't tolerate. During her brief seasons in London before her father's death, Arabella had drawn attention everywhere she went. Her striking beauty, combined with an unconventional education and a tendency to speak her mind, had made her both fascinating and dangerous in equal measure. Suitors had circled like wolves, much to Lady Prudence's fury. A young woman should be modest, demure, biddable, her stepmother had lectured endlessly. Not opinionated, not educated beyond what's proper, and certainly not so bold as to discuss politics and literature as though she were a man. "You embarrass this family, Arabella. You make Cordelia look like a mouse by comparison." The irony was that Arabella had never sought attention. Her father had educated her himself after her mother's death, finding solace in teaching his daughter everything he would have taught a son. She read philosophy and poetry, understood estate management and finance, could debate the merits of crop rotation as easily as she could discuss Shakespeare. It had never occurred to her that such knowledge was dangerous until Lady Prudence made it abundantly clear. The sound of hoofbeats on the drive pulled Arabella from her reverie. She stood quickly, moving back to the window. Through the rain, she could make out a magnificent black horse and its rider, a tall figure in a greatcoat struggling against the storm. "Are we expecting anyone?" Mrs. Marsh joined her at the window, squinting through the downpour. "No one ever comes here," Arabella murmured, watching as the rider dismounted. Even through the rain she could see he was a gentleman. His bearing, his clothing, the quality of his horse, all spoke of wealth and breeding. Perhaps he's lost. The knock at the door was firm and confident. Mrs. Marsh moved to answer it, but Arabella stopped her with a hand on her arm. Something, instinct, curiosity, or simply the desperate need for any break in the monotony of her existence, made her want to answer it herself. She opened the door to find a man perhaps 30 years of age, water streaming from his dark hair and greatcoat. He was handsome in a way that was almost unsettling, sharp cheekbones, intense dark eyes, and a mouth that seemed designed for both severity and sensuality. But it was the kindness in his expression as he looked at her, the complete absence of judgment or calculation, that stopped her breath. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice deep and touched with an accent she couldn't immediately place. "I seek Miss Hawthorne. I am Duke Matteo di Severini, Duke of San Rinaldo." "I believe I'm expected." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Arabella knew exactly who he was, the Italian duke who had arranged a marriage with Cordelia Hawthorne, sight unseen, based on correspondence and family connections. He was supposed to arrive at Hawthorne Manor, to meet his intended bride in the grand drawing room, to begin the formal courtship that would lead to their wedding. He was not supposed to be standing on her doorstep, looking at her as though she were the answer to a question he'd been asking all his life. She should correct him immediately, should explain that he'd been misdirected, that Miss Cordelia Hawthorne resided at the main house visible through the trees, that she herself was merely the forgotten daughter, the exile, the family's shameful secret. But as she stood there, water beginning to soak through her simple day dress, looking into eyes that held no disdain, no dismissal, no awareness of her supposed unworthiness, something fierce and desperate seized her heart. "Your Grace," she heard herself say, her voice remarkably steady, "please come in out of the rain." Matteo di Severini stepped into the modest entrance hall, immediately aware that something was not as he'd expected. The house was small, charming certainly and well maintained, but hardly the grand estate he'd been led to believe the Hawthorne family occupied. The furnishings were quality but worn, the decor tasteful but sparse, and the woman before him was nothing like the description he'd received. He'd been told Miss Hawthorne was 18, pleasant-featured, accomplished in the usual feminine arts, and of a mild, biddable temperament. The woman taking his wet greatcoat was certainly beautiful, extraordinarily so, with thick chestnut hair pinned loosely at her nape, eyes the color of amber, and features that seemed designed to haunt a man's dreams. But there was nothing mild about her. Even in her obvious surprise at his arrival, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of intelligence and strength. "I apologize for arriving in such a state," Matteo said, as an elderly woman appeared with towels. "The storm came upon me quite suddenly, and the directions I received in the village brought me here." "The weather has been terrible all week," the woman, Miss Hawthorne, he presumed, said softly. "Mrs. Marsh, would you prepare tea? His Grace must be frozen through." "Of course, Miss Arabella," the elderly servant said, and Matteo caught the name with interest. "Arabella," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It suited her far better than the insipid Cordelia he'd been expecting. Her beautiful name. He saw color rise in her cheeks, a becoming flush that made her even lovelier. "Thank you, Your Grace. Please come into the parlor. There's a fire, and you can warm yourself while we wait for the tea." The parlor was as modest as the rest of the house, but it had an undeniable charm. Books lined one wall, an impressive collection that immediately drew his attention. A pianoforte stood in one corner, sheet music scattered across its surface. The room spoke of education and refinement, but also of straitened circumstances. "You seem surprised, Your Grace," Arabella said quietly, watching him examine the room. Matteo turned to face her, deciding on honesty. "I confess the house is not what I expected. I was told the Hawthorne estate was quite grand." Something flickered across her face, pain perhaps, or resignation. And so it is. The main house is visible from here, through those trees. This is Rosewood Cottage. I prefer the quiet. It was clearly a lie, or at least not the whole truth. Matteo had not built a successful mercantile empire by failing to read people, and everything about this woman suggested she was not living here by choice, but he had also learned when to press and when to allow mysteries to unfold in their own time. I understand the appeal of solitude, he said instead, moving to the bookshelf, though I confess I would find it difficult to be too isolated with such a library at hand. You have excellent taste in literature. Do I? She moved to stand beside him, and he caught the faint scent of lavender and something else, something uniquely her. What gives you that impression? He pulled a volume from the shelf. Dante, in the original Italian. Not a common choice for an English ladies' library. I find the translation loses much of the poetry, she said, and there was challenge in her voice now, as though she expected him to mock her for such knowledge. I agree entirely, Matteo said, genuinely pleased. Tell me, do you prefer the Inferno or the Paradiso? Neither, she replied immediately. The Purgatorio is the most human of the three. The Inferno is too absolute in its punishments, the Paradiso too distant in its rewards. But Purgatorio, that's where we see souls struggling, hoping, changing. That's where the real drama lies. Matteo stared at her, feeling something shift in his chest. In all his 30 years, through countless social engagements and attempted matchmaking, he had never met a woman who could discuss Dante with such insight, let alone one who held an opinion so closely aligned with his own. You surprise me, he said softly. Is that a compliment or a criticism? The former, I assure you. I had not expected to find such a kindred spirit. Mrs. Marsh's arrival with the tea tray broke the moment, but Matteo found he couldn't look away from Arabella as she poured. Her movements were graceful but unpracticed. She was not accustomed to playing hostess, he realized. Everything about her suggested a life lived in the margins, and he found himself increasingly curious about the circumstances that had led to such an arrangement. Your journey from Italy must have been arduous, Arabella said, handing him a cup. I hope the weather was more favorable at sea than it has been on land. The crossing was tolerable, though I confess I am more comfortable on horseback than aboard ship. He accepted the tea gratefully, warming his hands on the cup. I am eager to settle in England, however. I have business interests here that require my attention, and of course there is the matter of, that is to say, he trailed off, suddenly uncertain. The marriage arrangement had been negotiated entirely through correspondence and intermediaries. It was a practical matter. His Italian estates needed an influx of English capital, and the Hawthorne family wanted the prestige of a title for their daughter. But looking at Arabella now, he found himself hoping that practicality might transform into something more. The matter of your intended marriage, Arabella finished for him, her voice carefully neutral. Yes, Matteo said, watching her closely, though I confess I had not expected to find myself so. That is, the letters I received hardly did justice to... He stopped, aware that he was handling this badly. But Arabella was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, hope and fear and something desperate all tangled together. Your Grace, she said quietly, setting down her own cup with trembling hands. I should tell you. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it shook the windows. The storm had intensified, rain now coming down in torrents that made the world beyond the glass nearly invisible. Heavens, Mrs. Marsh exclaimed, moving to the window. That's a fearsome tempest. Your Grace, I don't think you should attempt to ride in this. The roads will be impassable, and it's nearly dark already. Matteo moved to join her, assessing the situation. She was right. The storm showed no signs of abating, and darkness was falling rapidly. To attempt the ride to wherever he was supposed to be staying would be foolhardy at best, potentially fatal at worst. Mrs. Marsh is correct, Arabella said, and he heard the strain in her voice. You must stay here until the storm passes. It's not what you're accustomed to, I'm sure, but we can offer you a clean bed and a warm fire. Matteo turned to look at her, seeing the conflict written plainly on her face. She was struggling with something, some decision that clearly caused her pain. But beneath it all he saw hope, fragile and desperate, but undeniably present. I would be grateful for your hospitality, he said gently, and I assure you, I have stayed in far worse accommodations during my travels. A clean bed and good company are all I require. The smile she gave him was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, sudden, brilliant, and so beautiful it made his breath catch. "Then you are most welcome, Your Grace," Arabella said softly. "Most welcome indeed." As Mrs. Marsh bustled off to prepare a room, Matteo found himself alone with Arabella once more. The firelight played across her features, and he was struck again by her loveliness, not the vapid prettiness of society beauties, but something deeper, something that spoke of intelligence and passion held carefully in check. "Tell me," he said, resuming his seat, "what do you do with your days in this quiet retreat of yours?" Arabella settled into the chair across from him, seeming to relax slightly. "I read, mainly, and I walk when the weather permits. There's a small garden I tend, and I play the pianoforte, though not as well as I should like. No social calls, no visits to neighbors?" Something shuddered in her expression. "I prefer my own company." Another lie, or another half-truth, but Matteo let it pass, instead asking, "And what are you reading currently?" Her face brightened immediately. "I've just finished Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Have you read it?" Matteo nearly choked on his tea. Mary Wollstonecraft was hardly considered appropriate reading for young ladies. Her ideas on women's education and independence were deemed dangerously radical by most of society. That Arabella not only read such material but admitted to it so openly was remarkable. "I have," he said carefully, "though I confess I'm surprised to find it in your library. It's not, that is, it's somewhat controversial." "Truth often is," Arabella replied, and there was steel beneath the softness of her voice now. "I find it difficult to understand why advocating for women's education should be considered radical. Surely an educated woman is better equipped to manage a household, raise children, and contribute meaningfully to society." "I agree with you entirely," Matteo said, and watched surprise flicker across her face. "In Italy, I have employed several women in positions typically reserved for men. They have proven themselves more than capable. Intelligence is not the province of one sex alone." "You truly believe that?" Arabella leaned forward, her amber eyes bright with interest. "You're not simply saying what you think I wish to hear." "I have never been skilled at dissemblance," Matteo admitted with a slight smile. "My sister, Caterina, manages my estates in San Rinaldo with far more competence than I ever could. She has a gift for numbers and organization that I lack entirely. I learned early that ability matters far more than convention." "You have a sister?" Arabella's voice was wistful. "Is she in Italy?" "Yes, with her husband and their 3 children. She writes to me regularly, usually to inform me that I'm managing some aspect of the business incorrectly." He smiled at the thought. "I miss her terribly." "You're fortunate," Arabella said softly, "to have family that values you, supports you. That's a rare gift." There was such loneliness in her voice that Matteo felt his heart constrict. Whatever had brought this remarkable woman to this isolated cottage, it had not been her choice, and it had separated her from people she loved. "Tell me about your family," he prompted gently. Arabella looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. "There's little to tell. My father died 6 years ago. My mother passed when I was born. I have a half-sister, but we do not live together." "And your stepmother?" "Lady Prudence resides at the main house with Cordelia, my half-sister." Her voice was carefully expressionless now. "As I said, I prefer the quiet life." Matteo wanted to press, to understand the pain he heard beneath her words, but he sensed that to do so would be to push her away. Instead, he changed the subject, asking about the countryside, the village, the history of the estate. Arabella answered with growing ease, her natural intelligence and curiosity evident in every response. They talked through dinner, a simple meal that Mrs. Marsh served with obvious affection for her mistress. They talked as the storm raged outside, as darkness fell completely, as the fire burned low and was rebuilt. They talked about books and ideas, about Italy and England, about philosophy and poetry and the nature of happiness. And with every word, every smile, every moment of genuine connection, Matteo felt himself falling deeper into something he had not anticipated, something that felt dangerously like fate. It was well past midnight when Mrs. Marsh finally insisted they retire, scandalous as it was for an unmarried woman to entertain a gentleman so late, storm or no storm. Arabella showed him to a small but comfortable guest room, her candle casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Thank you for your hospitality," Matteo said at the door. "I cannot remember when I have enjoyed an evening more." Arabella looked up at him, and in the candlelight she was so beautiful it hurt. "Nor can I," she whispered. "I hope. That is, when the storm passes, if you must leave, I will return," Matteo interrupted, surprising himself with the vehemence of the promise. "If you'll allow it, I will return." The smile she gave him was worth every mile he'd traveled, every storm he'd endured. "I would like that very much, Your Grace." "Matteo," he said softly. "Please, call me Matteo." "Matteo," she repeated, and his name on her lips was the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. "Good night, then." "Good night, Arabella." He watched her retreat down the hallway, light fading as she disappeared around the corner. When he finally closed the door and leaned against it, Matteo's heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with the storm outside and everything to do with the tempest the woman had unleashed within him. He should be horrified. He was here to marry Miss Cordelia Hawthorne, to fulfill a contract that would benefit both their families. But his intended bride was somewhere in that grand manor house he'd glimpsed through the trees, while he stood in a modest cottage, completely captivated by a woman who was clearly not what he'd been led to expect. Was Arabella his intended bride? The servant had called her Miss Arabella, but arrangements were often made using formal names rather than given ones. The family name was correct. The timing of his arrival matched the correspondence. And yet, something felt wrong, or perhaps right in a way that was wrong according to every social convention he knew. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow, when the storm passed, he would sort out the confusion. He would discover the truth about Arabella Hawthorne and her circumstances. He would determine whether this remarkable woman was indeed the one he'd crossed a continent to marry. But tonight, standing in the small guest room of Rosewood Cottage, Matteo allowed himself to simply feel the wonder of having found, in the most unexpected place, someone who saw the world as he did, who challenged his mind, even as she captured his heart. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside something new and precious had been born, something that would change the course of both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. In her own room, Arabella pressed her hands against her racing heart, knowing she had made a terrible mistake and unable to regret it. She should have told him the truth immediately, should have explained that he'd been misdirected, that she was the family outcast, that his true intended bride awaited him at Hawthorne Manor. Every moment she'd allowed him to remain in ignorance was a deception, a lie by omission that would inevitably cause pain. But when was the last time someone had looked at her the way Matteo de Severini had? When had anyone treated her as though her thoughts mattered, her opinions held value, her very existence was something to be treasured rather than hidden away? Never. The answer was never. In the 6 years since her exile, Arabella had learned to expect nothing from life beyond the walls of Rosewood Cottage. She had reconciled herself to a future of loneliness, of watching from a distance as Cordelia married and had children, as Lady Prudence triumphed in her campaign to erase the inconvenient daughter who had threatened to eclipse her precious child. But tonight, for a few stolen hours, Arabella had felt alive again. She had engaged in the kind of conversation she'd thought lost to her forever. She had seen admiration and respect in a man's eyes, had felt the spark of genuine connection, had dared to hope for something beyond mere survival. It was wrong. It was foolish. It was a fantasy that could only end in heartbreak. And yet, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the storm, Arabella found herself praying for just a little more time, a few days perhaps, before the truth destroyed this fragile, precious thing that had begun to bloom between them. A few days to feel valued, desired, seen. Tomorrow's problems could wait for tomorrow. Tonight, she would allow herself to dream of a man with dark eyes and a kind smile, a man who discussed Dante with her as though she were his equal, who promised to return as though her company was a gift rather than a burden. Tomorrow would bring consequences. But tonight, Arabella Hawthorne allowed herself to hope. Morning arrived with deceptive serenity, the violent storm of the previous night giving way to a crystalline autumn day. Arabella woke early, as was her habit, and stood at her window watching sunlight paint the drenched countryside in shades of gold and amber. The roads would still be muddy, she thought, but passable. Matteo would be able to leave if he wished. The thought sent a sharp pain through her chest. She dressed with more care than usual, choosing a simple morning gown of deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. It was one of her finer dresses, though still years out of fashion. Lady Prudence had cut off her clothing allowance, along with everything else, leaving Arabella to make do with garments from before her exile. Mrs. Marsh had altered them as best she could, but no amount of clever needlework could hide their age. Still, as Arabella pinned her hair into a soft chignon, she found herself hoping she looked presentable. It was vanity, she knew, and foolish vanity at that, but she couldn't seem to help herself. She found Matteo already awake, standing in the garden despite the muddy ground, examining the rose bushes she'd spent years cultivating. He wore no coat, just shirt sleeves and a waistcoat, and the morning sun caught in his dark hair, turning it almost blue-black. He looked younger in the daylight, more approachable, and when he turned and smiled at her approach, Arabella's heart performed an uncomfortable acrobatic feat. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I hope you don't mind my invasion of your garden. I couldn't resist the roses. They're magnificent even this late in the season." "Thank you," Arabella replied, joining him beside a particularly fine specimen still bearing several deep crimson blooms. "My father planted these. I've tried to maintain them as he would have wished. He clearly loved beauty," Matteo observed, but his eyes were on her face, not the roses. Arabella felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned her attention firmly to the flower. "He loved my mother. These were her favorites. After she died, he planted them everywhere, as though surrounding himself with what she loved might bring her back somehow." "That must have been difficult for you," Matteo said gently, "growing up with such a visible reminder of loss." "Actually, I found it comforting," Arabella admitted. "I never knew my mother. She died bringing me into the world. But through these roses, through the stories my father told, I felt connected to her. She wasn't just an absence, she was a presence made of petals and perfume and love." Matteo was quiet for a moment, and when Arabella dared to glance at him, she found him watching her with an expression of such tenderness, it made her breath catch. "You speak beautifully," he said softly. "Everything you say reveals such depth of feeling. I confess it's quite intoxicating." Before Arabella could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal how thoroughly he affected her, Mrs. Marsh appeared at the kitchen door. "Breakfast is ready, Miss Arabella. And Your Grace, there's a young man here from the village. Says he was sent to inquire after your welfare, seeing as you didn't arrive at your intended destination last night." Reality crashed back with painful force. Arabella watched Matteo's expression shift from pleasure to confusion to something that might have been disappointment. "My intended destination," he repeated slowly. "Yes, of course. I had quite forgotten in the enjoyment of this morning." He turned to Arabella, and she saw the question in his eyes, a question she had no idea how to answer without revealing her deception. But before she could speak, he continued. "I should go and settle matters," he said. "Send word that I'm well and will arrive shortly. But first, if I may, I would very much like to have breakfast with you. I find I'm not quite ready to leave Rosewood Cottage." "Of course," Arabella managed, relief and dread warring in her chest. "Please, come inside." Over breakfast, Mrs. Marsh's excellent cooking somewhat wasted on Arabella, whose stomach was too knotted with anxiety to appreciate it. Matteo spoke with the messenger, a fresh-faced youth named Tom Blackwood, who regarded the Duke with a mixture of awe and nervousness. "They was worried sick up at the manor, Your Grace," Tom explained between bites of the breakfast Mrs. Marsh had insisted on providing. "When you didn't arrive yesterday, what with the storm and all, they feared something terrible had happened." "The storm caught me unprepared," Matteo said smoothly. "I'm grateful to have found shelter here. You'll convey my apologies to the household and inform them I'll arrive this afternoon." "Yes, Your Grace, though I confess I'm puzzled why you came here first. The directions in the village were quite clear. Hawthorne Manor is the grand house on the hill, not this cottage." Arabella's hand froze halfway to her teacup. This was it, the moment when everything would unravel. Tom Blackwood knew every family in the area. He would know that she was the cast-off daughter, that Cordelia was the one Matteo should have been seeking. But Matteo spoke before Tom could continue. "The storm was disorienting, and in my haste to find shelter, I must have taken a wrong turning. Fortune favored me, however, as I found the most excellent company here at Rosewood Cottage." Tom's eyes widened as he looked at Arabella, clearly noting her for the first time. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you're Miss Arabella, aren't you? I didn't recognize you at first." "Yes," Arabella said quietly, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "I should have said, you're not who His Grace is meant to meet. That would be Miss Cordelia Hawthorne, your half-sister, up at the manor. Lady Prudence has been in a right state, preparing for His Grace's arrival." The silence that followed was deafening. Arabella couldn't bring herself to look at Matteo, couldn't bear to see the realization dawn in his eyes that she had deceived him, allowed him to believe she was his intended bride, when she was merely the family embarrassment tucked away out of sight. "I see," Matteo said, his voice carefully neutral. "And Miss Arabella is—" "The elder daughter, Your Grace," Tom explained, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room. "From Mr. Hawthorne's first marriage. She lives here at the cottage. Prefers the quiet, they say, though some folk think it's a shame, a young lady living alone like this when she should be up at the manor with her family." "Indeed," Matteo said, and Arabella risked a glance at him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, those dark, expressive eyes that had looked at her with such warmth, now held questions she couldn't begin to answer. He knew. He understood that she had allowed him to believe a lie, had accepted his attention and conversation, and growing affection under false pretenses. "Well," Tom said cheerfully, rising from the table, "I'd best be getting back with the news. Lady Prudence will want to prepare for your arrival properly, Your Grace. Miss Arabella, always a pleasure." When he was gone, the silence stretched unbearably. Arabella stood, her hands trembling as she set down her napkin. "I should explain," she began, but her voice broke. "Yes," Matteo said quietly, "I believe you should." She couldn't bear to look at him, couldn't face the judgment she knew she'd see. Instead, she walked to the window, staring out at the garden without seeing it. "You asked me yesterday about my family, and I told you I preferred solitude," she said, each word carefully controlled. "That was not entirely truthful. I live here because I have no choice. 6 years ago, when my father died, my stepmother, Lady Prudence, decided I was a threat to her daughter's prospects. I was too forward, too educated, too noticeable. So she exiled me here, cut off my allowance to the barest minimum, and made it clear I was no longer part of the family. And last night when I arrived," Matteo said, his voice still maddeningly neutral, "you knew I had come to meet your half-sister. You knew I was intended for Miss Cordelia Hawthorne." "Yes," Arabella whispered, "and yet you said nothing. You allowed me to believe that you were the woman I had crossed a continent to marry." "I never claimed to be Cordelia," the words burst out of her, sharp with desperation. "I never said I was your intended bride. You made assumptions, and I simply didn't correct them. A lie of omission is still a lie, Miss Hawthorne." The formal address cut deeper than any accusation could have. Miss Hawthorne, not Arabella. She had lost the right to that intimacy through her deception. "I know," she said, forcing herself to turn and face him. "I know it was wrong. I knew it the moment you arrived, and I should have told you immediately. But you looked at me as though I mattered, as though my thoughts and opinions were valuable, and I was so starved for that kind of recognition that I couldn't bear to give it up. So I let you believe what you wanted to believe, and I took what I had no right to take." Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and shameful. "I'm sorry, I'm so desperately sorry. But for one evening I wanted to be someone worthy of your attention, someone who wasn't the family scandal, the inconvenient daughter, the woman too dangerous to be allowed in society, and you gave me that gift even if I had to steal it." Matteo stood, and Arabella braced herself for his anger, his disgust, his deserved condemnation. But when he spoke, his voice was not cold. It was something far more complex. "Did it never occur to you," he said slowly, "that I might have chosen to spend the evening with you regardless? That the woman I found fascinating was not some imagined bride, but you, Arabella Hawthorne, with your sharp mind and passionate opinions and depth of feeling?" Arabella stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. "But you came here for Cordelia. You made a contract with my family. A contract negotiated by others, based on financial considerations and social advantage," Matteo interrupted. "I agreed to it because it seemed practical, because I needed English capital, and your family wanted an Italian title. But I never expected to find someone who could discuss Dante and Wollstonecraft, who tends her father's roses and reads philosophy in her isolation. I never expected to find you." Hope, painful and impossible, flared in Arabella's chest. "What are you saying?" Matteo moved toward her, stopping just close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "I'm saying that I understand why you made the choice you did. I don't condone the deception, but I understand the desperation that drove it. And more importantly, I'm saying that what I felt last night, the connection, the recognition of a kindred spirit, that was real, regardless of any misunderstanding about your identity. But you must honor your commitment to Cordelia," Arabella said, even as every fiber of her being rebelled against the words. "The contract can be renegotiated," Matteo said firmly. "I have not yet met Miss Cordelia. No formal engagement has been announced. There is still time to set things right. If setting things right means choosing the woman who has captured my interest so thoroughly that I can think of little else." Arabella's heart was racing so fast, she thought it might burst from her chest. "You cannot possibly mean to court me instead. Lady Prudence would never allow it. The scandal—" "I am a duke, Arabella," Matteo said, and there was steel beneath the gentleness now. "I bow to no one's will but my own. If I choose to court you, if I choose to propose marriage to you rather than your half-sister, that is my decision to make. The question is whether you would accept such a courtship." "Accept it?" Arabella laughed, the sound somewhere between joy and hysteria. "I would accept it with every fiber of my being, but you don't understand what you're offering to face. Lady Prudence will make your life a misery. She'll spread rumors, create scandal, do everything in her power to prevent our union. And Cordelia—" "What of Cordelia?" Matteo asked quietly. "Does she know of this arrangement?" Arabella nodded slowly. "Lady Prudence has been preparing her for months. She believes she's to marry a duke, that her future is secured. If you withdraw now, it will humiliate her." "Then I must be honest with her," Matteo said. "I must explain that circumstances have changed, that my affections are engaged elsewhere. It will be difficult, yes, but surely honesty is preferable to entering a marriage where my heart belongs to another woman." It was exactly the right thing to say, exactly what Arabella needed to hear. And yet, the reality of what he proposed terrified her. She had lived in fear of Lady Prudence's wrath for 6 years. The thought of deliberately provoking it was almost more than she could bear. "I need time," she said finally. "Before you make any declarations or decisions, I need you to go to Hawthorne Manor, meet Cordelia, see what you're giving up, see what complications you're inviting into your life. And then, if you still wish to pursue this impossible thing between us, we can discuss it further." Matteo studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her words. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. I will go to the manor. I will meet Miss Cordelia, and I will be scrupulously honest about my situation. But know this, Arabella. My mind is already made up. Whatever happens at Hawthorne Manor, it is you I will be thinking of. It is you I will return to, if you'll have me." He took her hand, raised it to his lips in a gesture so courtly and tender that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I will return this evening. Will you receive me?" "Yes," Arabella whispered. "Yes, I will receive you." After he left, after she watched him ride toward the manor house that should have been her home, toward the half-sister who should have been her rival, Arabella sank into a chair and allowed herself to truly feel the magnitude of what had just happened. A duke, a wealthy, titled, extraordinarily handsome duke, had chosen her. Not the proper daughter, not the carefully groomed heiress, but her, the exile, the scandal, the woman deemed too dangerous to exist in polite society. It was impossible. It was wonderful. It was terrifying. And it was only the beginning. Hawthorne Manor had not changed in the 6 years since Arabella's exile. The imposing Georgian structure still dominated the hilltop, its symmetrical facade and manicured grounds a testament to wealth and social position. Matteo approached it with a growing sense of unease, unable to shake the feeling that he was riding towards something he would regret. The butler who answered the door was a severe man in his 50s who regarded Matteo with barely concealed relief. "Your Grace, we have been most anxious for your arrival. Please come in. Lady Prudence is waiting in the drawing-room." The interior of the manor was everything Rosewood Cottage was not. opulent, grand, and completely devoid of warmth. Matteo's practiced eye noted the expensive furnishings, the artwork, the obvious displays of wealth. But there were no books casually left about, no music on the pianoforte, no signs of actual life being lived within these perfect walls. Lady Prudence proved to be a handsome woman in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed and radiating an air of controlled determination. She rose from her seat with perfect posture as Matteo was announced, her smile calculated to be welcoming without being warm. "Your Grace," she said, extending her hand. "What a relief to see you safe. We were beside ourselves with worry when you failed to arrive yesterday." "My apologies, Lady Prudence," Matteo replied, bowing over her hand with practiced courtesy. "The storm caught me unprepared, and I sought shelter at the first opportunity." "Yes. Young Tom informed us you spent the night at Rosewood Cottage." Lady Prudence's smile tightened fractionally. "With my stepdaughter, Arabella. I do hope she didn't bore you with her peculiarities." There was something in her tone that set Matteo's teeth on edge, a dismissiveness that bordered on contempt. "On the contrary, I found Miss Arabella to be excellent company. We had a most stimulating conversation." Lady Prudence's expression flickered with something that might have been alarm before she regained her composure. "How kind of you to say so. But come, you must meet Cordelia. She has been anticipating your arrival with great excitement." She led him to where a young woman sat near the window, embroidery in her lap. Miss Cordelia Hawthorne rose at their approach, and Matteo had his first proper look at his intended bride. She was pretty in a conventional way, fair-haired, delicate-featured, with the kind of beauty that followed all the current fashion plates. Her dress was expensive and perfectly styled, her hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure that must have taken her maid hours to achieve. She curtsied with perfect grace, her eyes downcast in a show of modesty. She was exactly what Matteo had expected, and absolutely nothing like what he wanted. "Your Grace," Cordelia said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is an honor to make your acquaintance." "The pleasure is mine, Miss Hawthorne," Matteo replied, trying to inject some warmth into his tone. "I apologize for the delay in my arrival." "Oh, there's no need for apologies," Cordelia said quickly, glancing at her mother as though seeking permission to speak. "These things happen. Mother says you were caught in the storm." "Indeed. I was fortunate to find shelter at Rosewood Cottage." Lady Prudence made a small sound of displeasure. "Yes, well, we needn't dwell on that unfortunate episode. Cordelia, dear, why don't you show His Grace the gardens? The weather has cleared beautifully." The gardens of Hawthorne Manor were as impeccable as the house, perfectly manicured, with no flower out of place, no leaf daring to fall where it shouldn't. As they walked, Cordelia kept her hands folded demurely before her, her eyes on the ground, speaking only when Matteo asked her direct questions. "Do you enjoy reading, Miss Hawthorne?" he asked, trying to find some point of connection. "Oh, I read what Mother suggests," Cordelia replied. "Conduct books, mainly, and the occasional novel if it's appropriate. I'm afraid I'm not terribly clever about such things. Arabella was always the scholar." She stopped abruptly, as though she'd said something wrong. "That is, I prefer more ladylike pursuits. Embroidery, watercolors, that sort of thing." "There's nothing wrong with those pursuits," Matteo said gently. "But do you enjoy them?" Cordelia looked at him with genuine confusion. "Enjoy them? I suppose I've never thought about it. They're what I'm supposed to do." Matteo felt a wave of sympathy for this girl, who had been so thoroughly molded by her mother that she seemed to have no sense of her own preferences or personality. But sympathy was not love, and courtesy was not attraction. They continued their walk, and Matteo made a genuine effort to draw Cordelia out, to find some spark of the person beneath the perfect facade. But with every bland response, every careful deflection to what her mother thought or what was proper, he became more certain that this marriage would be a disaster. When they returned to the house, Lady Prudence was waiting with refreshments and a determination to monopolize the conversation. She spoke at length about the advantages of the union, about her plans for the wedding, about how perfectly suitable Cordelia would be as a duchess. Throughout it all, Cordelia sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of dutiful obedience. It was Arabella he saw when he looked at Cordelia, not because they resembled each other, but because of the stark contrast between them. Where Arabella was passionate and opinionated, Cordelia was passive and agreeable. Where Arabella challenged and engaged, Cordelia acquiesced and withdrew. Where Arabella seemed to vibrate with suppressed life and feeling, Cordelia appeared to be a beautifully dressed automaton, programmed to perform the role of the perfect bride. As the afternoon wore on, Matteo came to a decision. It was not fair to Cordelia, perhaps, but it would be even less fair to marry her when his heart belonged elsewhere. He needed to be honest, needed to end this charade before it caused more harm. "Lady Prudence," he said during a lull in her monologue about wedding arrangements, "I must speak with you privately. There is a matter of some delicacy we need to discuss." Lady Prudence's smile faltered. "Of course, Your Grace. Cordelia, perhaps you should retire to your room. I'll send for you when His Grace departs." When they were alone, Lady Prudence's expression hardened. "If this is about Arabella—" "It is," Matteo said firmly. "Lady Prudence, I must be frank with you. The woman I met last night, your stepdaughter, has captured my interest in a way I did not anticipate. I cannot in good conscience proceed with a marriage to Miss Cordelia when my affections are engaged elsewhere." Lady Prudence's face flushed an ugly red. "This is outrageous. You made a contract, Your Grace. We have an agreement." "We have a preliminary arrangement, nothing more," Matteo corrected. "No formal engagement has been announced, no contract signed. I am well within my rights to withdraw before making any binding commitment." "You spent one evening with that girl and you think you know her." Lady Prudence's voice dripped with venom. "Let me tell you about Arabella Hawthorne, Your Grace. She is willful, disobedient, and dangerously intelligent. She has no sense of propriety, no understanding of a woman's proper place. Her father spoiled her terribly, filled her head with ideas no lady should entertain. That is why she lives in that cottage, because she is not fit for decent society. Or perhaps," Matteo said coldly, "she lives there because you were threatened by her, because you feared she would eclipse your daughter and ruin your careful plans. Tell me, Lady Prudence, was exile really about protecting Cordelia, or was it about ensuring you maintained control?" Lady Prudence's eyes flashed with fury. "How dare you? I am protecting my daughter from scandal, from association with a woman who has no regard for convention." "What I see," Matteo interrupted, "is a woman who has systematically destroyed her stepdaughter's life out of jealousy and spite. You took her home, her family, her future, and relegated her to poverty and isolation, and you did it while congratulating yourself on your maternal devotion. If you pursue this madness, you will regret it," Lady Prudence hissed. "I will make certain that every drawing room in England knows about this insult. Your business interest will suffer. Your reputation will be tarnished. Is one evening with a fallen woman worth all that?" Matteo rose, his patience exhausted. "Miss Arabella is not fallen, she is neglected. And yes, Lady Prudence, she is worth far more than your good opinion or your threatened scandal. I will not be marrying Miss Cordelia. I suggest you inform her of this change in circumstances as gently as possible. The girl deserves better than to be caught in the middle of our dispute." "You'll hear from my solicitors," Lady Prudence threatened, rising as well. "Do send them round," Matteo replied calmly. "Mine are excellent and will be happy to review any claims you think you have. Good day, Lady Prudence. I trust I can find my own way out." He left Hawthorne Manor with a sense of liberation, as though he'd shed a weight he hadn't fully realized he was carrying. The afternoon sun was slanting through the trees as he rode back toward Rosewood Cottage, and with every stride his horse took, Matteo felt more certain he was riding toward his future, rather than away from an obligation. He found Arabella in her garden, tending the roses in the golden afternoon light. She looked up at his approach, her face a mixture of hope and fear that made his heart ache. "You came back," she said softly. "I promised I would," Matteo replied, dismounting. "And I always keep my promises." He crossed to where she stood among the roses, taking her hands in his despite the impropriety. "I met Miss Cordelia. She is a perfectly pleasant young woman who deserves a husband who can love her properly. I am not that man, Arabella. My heart has already made its choice." "Lady Prudence will never accept this," Arabella warned, even as her fingers tightened around his. "She'll fight you with everything she has." "Let her fight," Matteo said fiercely. "I have faced far worse than one bitter woman's machinations. What I cannot face is a life without you." Arabella's eyes filled with tears. "You barely know me. How can you be so certain?" "How can I not be?" Matteo countered. "In one evening, you showed me more of your true self than most people reveal in years. I know you are intelligent, passionate, kind, despite the cruelty you've endured. I know you tend your father's roses and read Dante in the original Italian. I know that when you smile, it feels like the sun breaking through clouds. What more do I need to know to be certain you are the woman I want to build a life with?" "This is madness," Arabella whispered, but she was smiling through her tears. "Complete and utter madness." "Then let us be mad together," Matteo said, and bent to kiss her. It was a gentle kiss, tender and questioning, a promise rather than a demand. But when Arabella's arms came up around his neck, when she kissed him back with a fervor that matched his own, Matteo knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Arabella rested her forehead against his. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Matteo said, "we court properly. I will call on you here at Rosewood Cottage. We will get to know each other as we should have from the start, without deception or pretense. And when the time is right, when you are ready, I will ask you to marry me. And you, my darling Arabella, will say yes." "Will I?" she teased, though her eyes were bright with joy. "You will," Matteo confirmed, "because we are both far too intelligent to let something as inconvenient as scandal and social convention stand in the way of happiness." As the sun set over the Yorkshire countryside, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Arabella and Matteo stood together in the garden, planning a future that only yesterday had seemed impossible. The road ahead would not be easy, Lady Prudence would make certain of that, but for the first time in 6 years, Arabella felt hope blazing in her chest, bright and fierce and unquenchable. She had been abandoned by her family, exiled and forgotten. But in being relegated to Rosewood Cottage, in that supposed punishment, she had found something infinitely precious. A man who saw her worth, who valued her mind and spirit as much as her beauty, who chose her not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire and respect. It was, Arabella thought as Matteo's arms tightened around her, the most wonderful mistake that had ever been made. The next 3 weeks passed in a haze of cautious joy and mounting tension. Matteo called at Rosewood Cottage daily, sometimes bringing books from the lending library in the village, sometimes arriving with nothing but his company and conversation. They walked in the gardens, talked by the fire, and slowly, carefully, began to build something real from the foundation of that first deceptive evening. Mrs. Marsh chaperoned with a discretion born of affection for her mistress and growing fondness for the Duke, who made Arabella's eyes shine. She would sit in the corner with her needlework, close enough for propriety, but far enough to grant them the illusion of privacy. "Tell me about your childhood in Italy," Arabella said one afternoon as they sat together in the parlor. Outside, November rain drummed against the windows, but inside it was warm and peaceful. Matteo smiled at the memory. "I grew up in San Rinaldo, a small duchy in the north. My father died when I was young, so I became duke at 15, far too young for such responsibility. My mother guided me through those early years, teaching me about duty and honor and the weight of a title." "It must have been difficult," Arabella said softly, "losing your father so young." "It was, but I had my mother and my sister Caterina, and they kept me grounded. Caterina especially. She's 3 years younger than I am, but she's always been far more sensible." He laughed. "She told me once that I had the tendency to overthink simple matters and act impulsively on important ones. I'm afraid she was correct." "Is that what this is?" Arabella asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. "An impulsive decision." Matteo reached for her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "This is the most thoroughly considered decision of my life. Every moment I spend with you confirms that I made the right choice." Such moments of sweetness were balanced by darker realities. Word of Matteo's rejection of Cordelia had spread through the county with the speed of wildfire, and with it came speculation, gossip, and Lady Prudence's carefully orchestrated campaign of revenge. The first blow came through the village merchants. Arabella discovered that her already meager credit had been completely cut off. Lady Prudence had ensured that no tradesman would extend her any further consideration. When Matteo learned of this, he immediately established accounts in Arabella's name, but the damage to her reputation had been done. "She's telling everyone I seduced you," Arabella said one evening, her voice tight with suppressed anger, "that I deliberately deceived you, threw myself at you, used feminine wiles to steal you from poor innocent Cordelia." "Let her talk," Matteo said firmly. "Anyone with sense will see through such transparent malice." But Arabella knew better. Society loved a scandal, and the story Lady Prudence was spinning, of a wicked stepdaughter who had connived to steal her innocent sister's intended husband, was far too delicious to resist. The second blow came when Arabella's small allowance was stopped entirely. A terse letter from Lady Prudence's solicitor informed her that as she had demonstrated behavior unbecoming of the Hawthorne name, the family felt no further obligation to support her residence at Rosewood Cottage. "She means to starve me out," Arabella said, staring at the letter. "Force me to leave Yorkshire entirely." "Then you'll move to my estate," Matteo declared immediately. "I've taken rooms at the inn in the village, but I've also leased Hartley House. It's a substantial property a few miles from here. You and Mrs. Marsh can reside there with perfect propriety, with my housekeeper as chaperone." "That would only fuel the gossip," Arabella protested. "People would say I was your mistress." "People will say what they wish regardless of what we do," Matteo interrupted. "I will not allow you to suffer because of Lady Prudence's vindictiveness. Please, Arabella, let me help you." In the end she agreed, because the alternative was to return to Hawthorne Manor and beg Lady Prudence's forgiveness, something she would rather die than do. The move to Hartley House was accomplished quietly, and if it set tongues wagging, Arabella tried not to care. But caring and not caring were two different things, and the weight of social disapproval grew heavier with each passing day. It was during this time that Cordelia made her surprising appearance at Hartley House. Arabella was in the library when the butler announced her half-sister, and her first instinct was to refuse the visit. But curiosity and an old, half-forgotten fondness for the girl she'd once known made her agree. Cordelia had changed in the 6 years since Arabella's exile. At 18, she had shed the last of her childhood softness and become the perfect reproduction of Lady Prudence's ideal woman, poised, proper, and completely devoid of spontaneity. But as she entered the library, Arabella saw something unexpected in her half-sister's eyes, genuine distress. "Arabella," Cordelia said, and her voice trembled, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I know we haven't spoken in years, but I needed to see you." "Sit down, Cordelia," Arabella said gently, surprised to find she meant it. "Would you like tea?" "No, thank you. I cannot stay long. Mother doesn't know I'm here." Cordelia perched on the edge of a chair, her hands twisting in her lap. "I came to apologize." Arabella blinked in surprise. "Apologize? For what?" "For not speaking up when Mother sent you away. For not visiting you all these years. For allowing you to be erased from our family as though you never existed." Tears spilled down Cordelia's cheeks. "I was only 12 when Father died, and I was frightened of Mother's temper. But that's no excuse. You were my sister, and I abandoned you." The pain in Cordelia's voice was genuine, and Arabella felt her own eyes sting with tears. "You were a child. You couldn't have changed what Lady Prudence decided." "Perhaps not then," Cordelia admitted, "but I could have visited, could have written, could have done something to let you know you weren't completely alone. Instead, I told myself that you preferred solitude, that you were happier away from us. It was easier than facing my own cowardice." Arabella moved to sit beside her half-sister, taking her hand. "Cordelia, I never blamed you. You were caught in an impossible situation. I know about Duke de Severini," Cordelia said quietly. "I know he rejected me in favor of you. Mother is furious, of course, but I'm not." "Is that terrible of me?" "Not terrible at all," Arabella said softly, "but I don't understand. Surely you're disappointed. You were expecting to marry a duke, to have a brilliant match." Cordelia shook her head, a small, sad smile playing at her lips. "I was expecting to do what Mother wanted, as I always do, but when I met His Grace, when he looked at me with such polite disinterest, I felt nothing but relief. I didn't want to marry him, Arabella. I don't want to marry anyone that Mother chooses for me." This was a new Cordelia, one Arabella had never seen before. "What do you want?" she asked gently. "I don't know," Cordelia admitted. "That's the terrible thing. I've spent so long being what Mother wanted that I have no idea what I want for myself. But when I heard that you and Duke de Severini had formed an attachment, that he chose you despite all of Mother's schemes and plans, I felt hope for the first time. If you could defy her, if you could choose your own path, perhaps I could too." They talked for over an hour, tentatively rebuilding the sisterly bond that Lady Prudence had worked so hard to destroy. Cordelia revealed a sharp wit beneath her dutiful exterior, and confessed to a secret passion for painting that her mother dismissed as unseemly. "She says art is acceptable as a young lady's accomplishment, but that no woman of quality would take it seriously," Cordelia explained. "But I love it, Arabella. When I paint, I feel like myself for the first time." "Then you should paint," Arabella said firmly. "Don't let anyone, not even Lady Prudence, take that away from you." When Cordelia finally rose to leave, she embraced Arabella tightly. "Thank you for not hating me," she whispered, "and please be happy with your Duke. Someone should have the courage to choose love over duty." After Cordelia left, Arabella sat in the library feeling oddly lighter. The meeting had given her something she hadn't realized she'd lost, the knowledge that she had not been completely erased from her family, that there was still someone who remembered her with affection, but the peace was short-lived. 2 days later, disaster struck in the form of an announcement in the London papers. Matteo arrived at Hartley House in a fury. The newspaper crumpled in his fist. "Have you seen this?" he demanded, his accent more pronounced than usual, always a sign of strong emotion. Arabella took the paper, her heart sinking as she read. "It has come to our attention that the Duke of San Rinaldo recently arrived in England to contract a marriage with Miss C.H. of Yorkshire, has instead formed a most irregular attachment to Miss A.H., the elder sister of his intended bride. Sources close to the family report that Miss A.H. employed considerable artifice to ensnare His Grace's affections, meeting him under false pretenses and allowing him to believe she was his intended bride. The Duke, being a foreigner unfamiliar with English social norms, was apparently deceived by this stratagem. Lady P., mother to the wronged Miss C.H., has expressed her profound disappointment in His Grace's want of honour and her stepdaughter's want of character. Society must wonder whether a man who so easily breaks his word is fit to bear an ancient and honourable title." The words blurred as Arabella's hands began to shake. "This is worse than I feared," she whispered. "She's not just attacking me, she's attacking your honour, your fitness to bear your title." "It's slander, pure and simple," Matteo growled. "My solicitors are already preparing a response." "But the damage is done," Arabella said, feeling the walls closing in. "Once such accusations are printed, the truth hardly matters. People will believe what they wish to believe, and what they wish to believe is always the worst." She stood abruptly, moving to the window. "You should go back to Italy. Break off this courtship before it destroys your reputation entirely. I'm not worth this, Matteo. Don't." His voice was sharp enough to make her turn. He crossed to her, taking her shoulders in his hands. "Don't you dare suggest that you're not worth fighting for. That's Lady Prudence talking, not you." "She's going to destroy us both," Arabella said, tears streaming down her face. "Everything you've built, your business interests, your standing in society. She'll tear it all down just to punish me." "Then let her try," Matteo said fiercely. "I survived the loss of my father at 15, the near bankruptcy of my estates at 20, and the restoration of my family's fortune through years of hard work. I am not so easily destroyed by one vindictive woman's lies." "But why?" Arabella demanded, her composure finally breaking. "Why would you risk everything for me? We've known each other barely a month. You could find someone else, someone without all this scandal and complication." "I don't want someone else," Matteo interrupted. "I want you, and I will have you, if you'll trust me enough to weather this storm." He pulled her close, and Arabella buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of him, bergamot and leather and something uniquely his own. "I'm frightened," she admitted. "I know, so am I." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "But we'll face it together." The storm intensified over the following week. More articles appeared, each more vicious than the last. Lady Prudence had clearly spent considerable money ensuring the story spread as widely and damagingly as possible. Arabella found herself the subject of speculation and gossip everywhere she went. The villagers who had once greeted her with polite friendliness now stared and whispered. But there were unexpected allies as well. Mrs. Marsh, loyal as ever, spread her own version of events among the servants and tradespeople. Cordelia, in a stunning act of defiance, contradicted her mother's story when questioned by acquaintances, earning herself a fortnight of confinement to her room. And Matteo's solicitors proved formidable indeed. They drafted responses to the newspapers, threatened legal action against the publishers, and began quietly gathering evidence of Lady Prudence's machinations. The turning point came from an unexpected quarter. Lord Edmund Hartley, a distinguished peer who had known Arabella's father, returned from London to his estate and invited both Arabella and Matteo to dinner. At 75, Lord Hartley was both respected and feared in society. His good opinion could make or break a reputation. "Your father was one of my dearest friends," Lord Hartley told Arabella over dinner. "It sickened me to see what that woman did to you after his death. I wanted to intervene, but you seemed to prefer your privacy, and I respected that. Now, however, I see I should have acted sooner." "You owe me nothing, my lord," Arabella said quietly. "Perhaps not. But I owed your father everything. He saved my estate from bankruptcy 30 years ago when no one else would help. The least I can do is ensure his daughter receives the support she deserves." Lord Hartley turned to Matteo. "Your Grace, you've shown remarkable courage in defying convention. It speaks well of your character." "I appreciate your saying so, my lord," Matteo replied, "though I confess the courage is all Miss Hawthorne's. She is the one who has endured years of mistreatment with grace and dignity." "Then we must ensure that dignity is recognized," Lord Hartley declared. "I'm hosting a ball in 3 weeks' time, the first major social event of the winter season in this county. I want you both to attend as my honored guests. Let society see that you have the support of those who matter." "Lord Hartley, the scandal," Arabella began, "will be silenced by my approval," Lord Hartley interrupted firmly. "Lady Prudence has had her way for too long. It's time someone reminded her that she is not the arbiter of all social judgment." As they left Lord Hartley's estate that evening, Arabella felt something shift in her chest. For 6 years, she had accepted her exile as inevitable, had believed herself powerless against Lady Prudence's machinations. But now, with Matteo beside her and unexpected allies emerging from the shadows, she began to believe that perhaps she could fight back, that perhaps she deserved to fight back. "Are you really willing to do this?" she asked Matteo as they drove through the dark countryside. "Attend Lord Hartley's ball, face down all the gossip and scandal?" Matteo took her hand, raising it to his lips. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make you my Duchess, Arabella Hawthorne. The question is whether you're ready to step out of the shadows and claim your rightful place in the world." Arabella looked at him. This remarkable man who had chosen her, fought for her, refused to abandon her despite every obstacle Lady Prudence could throw in their path, and she made her decision. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm ready." The storm was far from over, but for the first time Arabella felt she might survive it. More than survive it, she might actually win. The 3 weeks before Lord Hartley's ball passed in a flurry of preparation and mounting anticipation. Matteo insisted on providing Arabella with a proper wardrobe for the occasion, and though she initially protested the expense, he was adamant. "You are going to walk into that ballroom looking like the Duchess you will soon become," he declared. "Lady Prudence has tried to diminish you to make you feel small and unworthy. We will show her exactly how wrong she is." The modiste summoned from London was a sharp-eyed Frenchwoman named Madame Delacroix, who took one look at Arabella and smiled with professional satisfaction. "Ah, mademoiselle, you have the figure and the colouring to wear anything," she declared. "But for this occasion we must create something that will make every woman in the room green with envy, and every man regret that you are not available to them." The resulting gown was a masterpiece. Made of ivory silk with an overlay of the finest Brussels lace, it was both elegant and striking. The bodice was fitted to perfection, highlighting Arabella's figure without being improper, while the skirt fell in graceful folds that seemed to float when she moved. Delicate embroidery in gold thread adorned the hem and sleeves, catching the light with every movement. When Arabella saw herself in the mirror on the evening of the ball, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The 6 years of exile seemed to fall away, revealing the confident young woman she'd been before Lady Prudence's campaign to erase her. "You look magnificent," Mrs. Marsh said, tears in her eyes. "Your mother would be so proud." Matteo's reaction when he arrived to escort her confirmed the gown's success. He stopped in the doorway of the drawing room, staring at her with such open admiration that Arabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Arabella," he breathed, "you are exquisite." He himself looked devastatingly handsome in formal evening wear, his dark hair gleaming in the candlelight, his bearing every inch the Duke. As he helped her into the carriage, Arabella felt a surge of pride and possessiveness. This remarkable man had chosen her, and tonight they would make that choice public. The drive to Lord Hartley's estate was both too short and too long. Arabella's nerves mounted as they approached, knowing that Lady Prudence would be in attendance, that half the county would be watching their every move, judging, speculating, whispering. "I can feel you trembling," Matteo said softly, covering her hand with his. "Are you frightened?" "Terrified," Arabella admitted. "I haven't been to a social event in 6 years. I feel like I've forgotten how to navigate such situations." "Then follow my lead," Matteo said. "And remember, you are not the disgraced stepdaughter tonight. You are Miss Arabella Hawthorne, the woman I intend to marry, and you have every right to hold your head high." Lord Hartley greeted them personally at the entrance to the ballroom, making a deliberate show of his welcome. "Miss Hawthorne, you look splendid. And Your Grace, thank you for honoring us with your presence. Come, let me introduce you to some people worth knowing." As they entered the ballroom, Arabella felt every eye turn toward them. The music faltered momentarily, conversations died, and for a heartbeat, there was perfect, awful silence. Then Lord Hartley's booming voice cut through the quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Duke Matteo de Severini of San Rinaldo and Miss Arabella Hawthorne, daughter of my late dear friend Thomas Hawthorne." It was a masterful move. By invoking both Matteo's title and Arabella's connection to her respected father, Lord Hartley had reminded everyone present that they were not dealing with scandal, but with legitimate members of society. The music resumed, conversation restarted, and slowly, cautiously, people began to approach, drawn by curiosity and the desire to curry favor with a duke and one of the county's most influential peers. Arabella moved through the evening in a daze of anxiety and wonder. Matteo never left her side, his hand at her elbow, his presence a constant reassurance. They danced twice, scandalous really, given they weren't yet formally engaged, but Arabella found she didn't care. In Matteo's arms, moving to the music, she felt safe and cherished and exactly where she belonged. It was during their second dance that she saw Lady Prudence. Her stepmother stood at the edge of the ballroom, resplendent in purple silk, with Cordelia beside her in a gown of pale pink. Lady Prudence's expression was thunderous as she watched Arabella and Matteo, clearly furious that her campaign of destruction had not succeeded in driving them apart. But it was Cordelia who caught Arabella's attention. Her half-sister was smiling, a genuine, warm smile that transformed her usually careful features. When their eyes met across the room, Cordelia gave a small nod of approval, and Arabella felt tears prick her eyes. "That's your sister, isn't it?" Matteo asked, following her gaze. "She seems happy for you." "She is," Arabella said softly. "She's braver than I gave her credit for." As the dance ended, disaster struck in the form of Lady Prudence herself. She swept across the ballroom with the determination of a woman who had endured enough, her voice carrying clearly as she approached. "Your Grace," she said, ignoring Arabella completely, "I must speak with you about this unfortunate situation, privately." "There is nothing to discuss privately that cannot be said before Miss Hawthorne," Matteo replied coolly. "Very well." Lady Prudence's eyes glittered with malice. "Then let me say this publicly. You have been deceived, Your Grace. My stepdaughter is a scheming, manipulative woman who deliberately misled you as to her identity. She allowed you to believe she was Cordelia, accepted your courtship under false pretenses, and has now trapped you into an association that will destroy your reputation. Surely a man of your intelligence can see he has been played for a fool." The nearby conversations faltered. People leaned closer, eager to hear how the Duke would respond to such an accusation. Matteo's expression didn't change, but Arabella felt the tension in him, the controlled fury. "Lady Prudence," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom, You are quite correct that there was a deception involved in my first meeting with Miss Hawthorne. However, the fault lies not with her, but with the circumstances you created." He turned to address the watching crowd. 6 years ago, when her father died, Miss Hawthorne was exiled from her own home by a stepmother who saw her as a threat to her own daughter's marriage prospects. She was relegated to poverty and isolation, cut off from her family and society, for no crime other than being beautiful and intelligent. When I arrived at her door by mistake, she hesitated to correct my assumption because for one evening she wanted to be treated with the respect and dignity that should have been her birthright. "She lied to you," Lady Prudence protested. "She omitted certain truths," Matteo corrected. "A failing I can well understand, given the cruelty she has endured. But unlike you, Lady Prudence, who have built your life on lies and manipulation, Miss Hawthorne told me the truth the very next morning. She gave me the opportunity to honor my commitment to your daughter, and I chose to withdraw that commitment because I had already met the woman I wished to marry." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Arabella's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Miss Arabella Hawthorne," Matteo continued, turning to face her and dropping to one knee, "has shown me what true courage looks like. She has endured years of mistreatment with grace and dignity. She has maintained her integrity and her kindness despite every reason to become bitter. She challenges my mind, touches my heart, and makes me want to be a better man. So I ask you now before all these witnesses, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The ballroom erupted in excited whispers. Arabella stared down at Matteo, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, of course, yes." As Matteo stood and took her in his arms, the ballroom erupted in applause. Even the musicians joined in, abandoning their instruments to clap and cheer. Lady Prudence stood frozen, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. But before she could speak, Lord Hartley stepped forward. "Lady Prudence," he said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the room. "I knew Thomas Hawthorne for 40 years. He was a good man who loved his daughter deeply. It broke my heart to see what you did to Arabella after his death, but I respected her apparent desire for privacy. Now I see I was wrong to remain silent." He turned to address the room. "Let me be clear. Miss Arabella Hawthorne has my full support and friendship. Anyone who speaks ill of her will find themselves unwelcome in my home and at my table. And I suspect," he added with a meaningful look around the room, "that most of you will prefer my friendship to Lady Prudence's. It was a gauntlet thrown and everyone present understood it. To support Lady Prudence now would be to alienate Lord Hartley, a social death sentence in this county. Lady Prudence understood it too. With a final glare of pure hatred, she turned on her heel and stalked from the ballroom. Cordelia hesitated, looking between her mother's retreating back and Arabella's tear-stained face. Then, in an act of rebellion that stunned everyone present, Cordelia walked across the ballroom and embraced her half-sister. "I'm so happy for you," she whispered. "You deserve every bit of this happiness." "Come with me," Arabella urged. "Don't go back to her, Cordelia. Stay with me at Hartley House." Cordelia pulled back, smiling through her own tears. "Not yet. I'm not as brave as you are, not yet. But someday I will be. Someday I'll find my own Matteo, and when I do, I'll remember how you fought for your happiness." As Cordelia left to follow her mother, the celebration resumed with renewed energy. People who had shunned Arabella for years now congratulated her, eager to curry favor with the future Duchess. It was hypocritical and transparent, but Arabella found she didn't care. She had Matteo, she had Lord Hartley's support, and she had proven that Lady Prudence's power over her was finally, irrevocably broken. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and dancing. Matteo seemed determined to dance with Arabella at every opportunity. Propriety be damned, and she was equally determined to let him. It was well past midnight when they finally left, stealing away from the celebration to find a moment of privacy in Lord Hartley's garden. The night was cold but clear, stars brilliant overhead, and Arabella shivered in her thin evening gown. Immediately, Matteo shrugged out of his coat and draped it around her shoulders. It smelled of him, and Arabella pulled it close, breathing in the comforting scent. "I can't believe you proposed in front of everyone," she said, half laughing, half crying. "You completely blindsided me." "I know," Matteo admitted, pulling her into his arms. "But Lady Prudence needed to understand that her power over you is finished, and I wanted everyone to know that I choose you, publicly and proudly, with no shame or hesitation." "You do realize we'll be married in scandal?" Arabella pointed out. "Society will whisper about this for years." "Let them whisper," Matteo said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "In a few years they'll have new scandals to discuss, and we'll be in Italy living our lives and not caring what narrow-minded people think." "Italy?" Arabella looked up at him in surprise. "Eventually, yes. I have responsibilities there that I cannot neglect forever, but we'll split our time. Winters in San Rinaldo, summers here in England. You'll love my estate, Arabella. It's beautiful, and my sister is desperate to meet the woman who finally captured my heart." They stood in the garden for a long time, making plans for their future, dreaming of the life they would build together. They would marry within the month, Matteo decreed. He saw no reason to wait when they were both certain of their feelings. Arabella agreed, though part of her could hardly believe this was real. A month ago she had been living in quiet desperation, resigned to a life of loneliness. Now she stood in a duke's arms, wearing his ring, planning their wedding and their future. "What are you thinking?" Matteo asked, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "I'm thinking about how strange fate is," Arabella admitted. "If the storm hadn't come, if the villagers had given you correct directions, if you had arrived at the manor house as planned, none of this would have happened. Then I am grateful for storms and misdirection and every twist of fate that led me to your door," Matteo said seriously. "You are the best mistake I ever made, Arabella Hawthorne." "And you are my second chance," Arabella replied, "my proof that sometimes life rewards courage rather than punishing it." As they kissed under the stars, Arabella felt the last of her fear and bitterness fall away. Lady Prudence had tried to break her, to erase her, to make her believe she was unworthy of love and happiness, but she had survived. More than survived, she had triumphed. The road ahead would not be without challenges. There would be more gossip, more scandal, more people who disapproved of their unconventional romance. But with Matteo beside her, with love and respect as their foundation, Arabella knew they would weather any storm. She had been abandoned by her family, exiled and forgotten. But in that exile she had found herself, and in finding herself, she had found the love she deserved. It was, she thought, as Matteo's arms tightened around her, the most perfect ending to what had started as the most imperfect beginning. Epilogue. 2 years later, the gardens of the Palazzo di Severini were in full bloom, roses and jasmine perfuming the warm Italian air. Arabella sat on a stone bench beneath an ancient olive tree, watching her husband play with their 6-month-old son, Alessandro Thomas di Severini. Matteo held the baby up, making him squeal with delight, his dark eyes so like his father's bright with joy. Arabella's heart swelled watching them, still unable to quite believe that this life was hers. "You're thinking too much again," Caterina said, settling onto the bench beside her sister-in-law. "I can see it in your face." Arabella smiled at her. Caterina had become not just a sister, but a dear friend, and Arabella treasured the relationship they had built over the past 2 years. "I'm just grateful," Arabella admitted. "Sometimes I wake up and fear it's all been a dream." "It's very real," Caterina assured her, "though I must say, watching my formerly serious, business-minded brother become completely ridiculous over a baby is quite surreal." They both laughed as Matteo continued his antics, completely absorbed in entertaining his son. A servant appeared with a letter. "For you, Your Grace, from England." Arabella's heart quickened as she recognized Cordelia's handwriting. Her half-sister wrote regularly now, and each letter brought news of her gradual emancipation from their stepmother's control. "Dearest Arabella, I hope this letter finds you and your family in good health. I have news that I hope will please you. I am engaged. His name is Mr. James Thornbury, and he is a gentleman of comfortable means who shares my passion for art. More importantly, he encourages me to pursue my painting seriously. We met at an exhibition in London, and Mother knows nothing of our courtship. I have learned discretion from watching your courage. We plan to marry in the spring, and will live in his estate in Dorset, far from Mother's influence. I am for the first time in my life truly happy. Lord Hartley continues to be a wonderful friend to both of us. He has promised to attend my wedding, and has assured Mother that any attempt to interfere will result in her complete social ruin. Even she is not foolish enough to cross him. I long to meet my nephew Alessandro. Perhaps when you return to England this summer, we might finally have the family reunion we have both deserved. With all my love, Cordelia Arabella finished reading with tears in her eyes. Matteo, seeing her expression, handed the baby to his sister and came to sit beside his wife. "Good news?" he asked gently. "The best news," Arabella replied, handing him the letter. "Cordelia is engaged. She's found her own happiness." Matteo read the letter, smiling. "I'm glad. She deserves it, after everything Lady Prudence put her through." "We should send a gift," Arabella said. "Something meaningful." "Already planning," Matteo teased. "But first, there's something I want to discuss with you." Arabella looked at him questioningly. "My business interests in England are thriving, thanks in large part to Lord Hartley's connections. I've been thinking we should establish a more permanent residence there, not Hartley House, which we've been leasing, but our own estate. Somewhere we can raise Alessandro and any future children with ties to both their Italian and English heritage." "I would like that," Arabella said softly. "But not in Yorkshire. I don't want to be nowhere near Yorkshire," Matteo assured her. "I was thinking Kent. Beautiful countryside, close enough to London for business, far enough from Lady Prudence that she'll never darken our door." "Perfect," Arabella agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, before Matteo spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking about that first night at Rosewood Cottage, about how a simple misdirection, a wrong turn in a storm, changed both our lives. Do you ever regret it?" Arabella asked quietly. "The scandal, the complications, the way it all began?" Matteo turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "Never. Not for a single moment. You are the best decision I ever made, Arabella. You and Alessandro and this life we've built together. It's more than I ever dreamed possible." "Even though I deceived you?" Arabella teased, though there was still a hint of old pain in her voice. "Even though you gave me the gift of seeing you as you truly are, without the weight of expectation or society's judgment," Matteo corrected. "That evening at Rosewood Cottage, you weren't the exiled daughter or the family scandal. You were just Arabella, brilliant and passionate and real. How could I not fall in love with that?" Arabella kissed him softly, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they drew apart, she saw Caterina had diplomatically retreated to give them privacy, taking Alessandro with her. "I love you," Arabella said simply. "I never thought I would be able to say those words and mean them with my whole heart. But I do, and I love you," Matteo replied. "My unexpected duchess, my perfect mistake, my Arabella." As the Italian sun set over the gardens, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Arabella reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had been abandoned by her family, exiled and forgotten, deemed too dangerous to exist in polite society. She had suffered years of loneliness and isolation, had believed herself unworthy of love or happiness. But sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as mistakes. Sometimes losing everything forces you to discover what truly matters. And sometimes being sent to the wrong door leads you exactly where you were meant to be all along. Lady Prudence had tried to erase her, but instead had inadvertently given her the freedom to become who she was always meant to be. The exile that was meant as punishment had become her salvation. The isolation that should have broken her had instead forged her into someone strong enough to fight for her own happiness. And now, sitting in an Italian garden with her husband and child, with a sister who had found her own courage and a future bright with promise, Arabella could finally say with certainty she had not just survived her abandonment. She had transcended it, transformed it, turned it into something beautiful. She was no longer the cast-off daughter, the family scandal, the woman too bright to be allowed to shine. She was Arabella de Severini, Duchess of San Rinaldo. She was a wife, a mother, a sister, a friend. She was loved, cherished, valued exactly as she was, and she was, at long last, genuinely and completely happy. The end. Dear friends, as we close this chapter of Arabella and Matteo's story, I invite you to reflect on the power of resilience and second chances. How often in life do we face rejection, abandonment, or circumstances that seem designed to diminish us. How often are we told, directly or indirectly, that we are too much or not enough, that our very existence is somehow problematic? Arabella's story reminds us that sometimes what appears to be our greatest setback becomes our greatest opportunity. Her exile, though painful and unjust, gave her the solitude to know herself, the strength to survive without external validation, and ultimately the clarity to recognize genuine love when it appeared at her door. She could have allowed bitterness to consume her. She could have become the person Lady Prudence accused her of being, manipulative, scheming, willing to do anything for advancement. Instead, she maintained her integrity, her kindness, her essential self, even in the darkest moments. And when opportunity came, when Matteo arrived at her door by mistake, she had the courage to take a risk, to allow herself to hope, to fight for the happiness she deserved. For those of you who feel forgotten or set aside, who carry the weight of family rejection or social disapproval, take heart from Arabella's journey. Your exile may be temporary, your suffering may have purpose, and the wrong door that opens before you might just lead to the right life. May you have the strength to endure difficult seasons, the wisdom to recognize genuine love when it appears, and the courage to fight for your own happiness, regardless of who thinks you don't deserve it. And may you always remember, sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest mistakes, and the most beautiful futures are built on the ruins of painful pasts. Until we meet again in another tale, may your own story be filled with second chances, unexpected blessings, and the courage to choose love over fear. With all our gratitude, the Legends of the Fall team. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Your presence means the world to us, and we create each tale with deep love and gratitude for you. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support, truly from the bottom of our hearts, keeps us motivated to bring you more stories filled with emotion, redemption, love, and powerful transformations. And don't forget, at the end of this video, another story from our channel will appear. Click it and let yourself be surprised by more emotional romances just like this one. Thank you for being here. The Legends of the Fall team.